What happens when a guest decides they've had enough live on air and the conversation doesn't go the way anyone expected? Make sure to subscribe to the Star Talks and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The studio lights are bright, the audience is already buzzing, and the camera pans across the table as the hosts settle in. The energy feels upbeat at first, the kind of morning where the crowd is clapping before the conversation even starts. The co-hosts are smiling, adjusting their cards, and the moderator leans toward the camera with that familiar, welcoming tone. "Good morning, everyone. We have a special guest with us today," she says as applause fills the room. Chris Evans is joining us. The audience cheers loudly as Chris waves, standing to greet them before sitting down. He looks relaxed, hands folded on the table, giving polite smiles to the panel. The conversation starts light. Updates about his recent projects, his charity work, and the reaction to his latest film. One of the hosts asks about his career choices, and Chris responds thoughtfully. "I try to choose projects that mean something to me. It's not just about the role, it's about the message." The audience nods. The tone is respectful. Another host follows up with a compliment about his consistency in interviews and how grounded he seems despite his fame. Chris laughs slightly and says he just tries to stay true to himself. So far, everything feels smooth. Then the conversation shifts. The moderator turns slightly and glances at her notes. "We do want to talk about something else today, public figures and political involvement. You've been open in the past about your views." Chris nods carefully. "I've always believed in using your platform responsibly." There's a murmur in the audience, not negative, just attentive. Then Alyssa Farah Griffin leans in, hands clasped together. Her tone is calm, not confrontational. "You've spoken strongly about encouraging people to vote and stay informed. But some critics say celebrities shouldn't influence political discussions at all. How do you respond to that?" The room quiets a little. This is the shift. Not dramatic, but noticeable. Chris pauses. He keeps his expression steady. "I think everyone has a voice. Whether you're an actor, a teacher, or a journalist, you have opinions. The difference is how you use them." A few audience members clap softly. Alyssa responds immediately, still measured. "But do you think there's a line? Because some people feel that when celebrities speak out, it can overshadow other voices." Chris nods, leaning forward slightly. "That's fair. I think it's important to listen more than we speak. I don't think I'm trying to overshadow anyone. I'm just sharing my perspective." The moderator interjects gently. "And that perspective carries weight." Chris gives a small smile. "Sure, but I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be about issues." The discussion begins to feel more layered. The hosts start building on each other's points. One brings up how social media amplifies celebrity opinions. Another mentions audience responsibility. Alyssa continues, still calm but direct. "When you post about political topics, do you consider how it might affect your fan base? Some people look up to you and may feel pressured." Chris answers carefully. "I don't want anyone to feel pressured. I encourage people to think for themselves. I share information, but I'm not telling anyone how to live their lives." The audience responds with mixed reactions, some applause, some quiet murmurs. The conversation grows slightly more focused. Alyssa leans in again. "But if you believe strongly about something, isn't staying silent also a choice?" Chris looks thoughtful. "It is. And sometimes silence can feel like complicity. But I also think there's a balance. I try to speak responsibly." The tone is still professional, no raised voices, but there's intensity in the air now. The panel is engaged, leaning toward him, not interrupting, but clearly pressing deeper. One of the other hosts asks, "Have you ever felt backlash from speaking out?" Chris exhales lightly. "Of course. That comes with it." The audience reacts with sympathetic sounds. A few people clap. Then Alyssa asks the question that changes the rhythm. "Do you think celebrities have a duty to use their influence in political conversations, or should they stay neutral?" There's a pause. Chris sits back in his chair. The room feels quieter. "I don't think there's a single rule," he says slowly. "Everyone should decide for themselves. I believe in civic engagement, but I also believe in humility. Nobody has all the answers." The hosts nod, but the conversation is clearly at a crossroads. The audience is fully engaged now. Alyssa responds, her tone firm but still respectful. Some viewers feel that when celebrities speak out, it can create division. How do you respond to people who say you contribute to that? Chris looks directly at her. The smile fades slightly, not angry but serious. "I don't want to divide people," he says. That's never my intention. If anything I say feels divisive, that's not what I'm aiming for. The moderator gently tries to shift tone. We appreciate the conversation. It's important to have these discussions. But the atmosphere has changed. Not explosive, just heavier. Chris folds his hands together. The audience is quiet, listening closely. The exchange feels more direct now. Alyssa adds one final point in this segment. It's a complicated issue. Many people admire you, and with that comes influence. Chris nods again. And I take that seriously. The camera cuts to the audience, attentive faces, some nodding, some whispering quietly. The moderator thanks him for the thoughtful discussion and transitions toward the next topic. But there's a subtle shift in Chris's body language. He glances down at the table for a moment, then back up. The segment is moving forward, but the tension from the exchange still lingers in the air. And as the show prepares for the next question, no one in the studio quite realizes yet that the conversation has reached a turning point, one that will change the tone of the entire appearance. The moderator transitions to a lighter topic, but the energy in the room doesn't reset as quickly as usual. Chris is still seated upright, hands folded, listening carefully as another host begins asking about his upcoming projects and what fans can expect next. The audience claps politely when he mentions a new collaboration. The tone briefly stabilizes, familiar ground, safe territory. Chris smiles again, answering questions about filming schedules and balancing work with personal time. He even jokes lightly about early call times, and the audience laughs. It feels like the conversation might settle, but Alyssa circles back gently. Before we move on completely, she says, turning toward him, I want to clarify something from earlier. You said you don't want to divide people. Do you think the current climate makes it harder for public figures to speak without being misunderstood? Chris nods. Absolutely. Everything gets amplified. A single sentence can become a headline. The moderator interjects, keeping the rhythm moving. That's true for everyone, not just actors. Chris agrees. Right. And I try to be thoughtful. But sometimes even thoughtful comments can be taken out of context. There's a murmur of agreement from parts of the audience. Alyssa leans forward slightly. When you say you're trying to be responsible, what does that look like practically? Do you consult anyone? Do you research before posting? The question is calm, but it feels more pointed. Chris responds steadily. I read. I talk to people I trust. I don't just post randomly. If I'm going to say something, I want it to be informed. A few audience members clap again. The moderator nods. That's important. For a moment, it seems like the panel is satisfied. But the tone of the exchange has shifted from general discussion to direct accountability. Not hostile, but more focused. Then Alyssa adds something that changes the temperature. Some viewers say that when celebrities speak about politics, it can overshadow experts who've studied these issues for years. How do you balance your voice with theirs? Chris pauses longer this time. I think experts should lead, he says carefully. I don't pretend to be an expert. If I'm talking about something, it's from a personal standpoint. The audience responds with scattered applause. Another host jumps in. But when you have millions of followers, even a personal standpoint can have impact. Chris nods. I understand that. There's a noticeable shift in his posture. Slightly more serious now, less relaxed than at the start of the segment. The moderator tries to keep the balance. This is why conversations like this matter. It's about perspective. Chris agrees again, but the exchange is becoming repetitive, not argumentative, but intense in its focus. Alyssa asks one more question, her voice steady. Do you ever worry that staying quiet might disappoint people who expect you to take a stand? Chris looks down briefly, then back up. I worry about disappointing people in general, he admits. But I also think it's important not to feel forced into speaking on every issue. The audience reacts with mixed responses, some applause, some quiet chatter. The moderator begins to pivot again, sensing the energy tightening. We appreciate you being open about this, she says. Chris nods. I appreciate the conversation. For a brief second, everything seems aligned. But then the moderator introduces a new angle, asking whether public figures should avoid controversial topics altogether to keep their platforms focused on entertainment. Chris leans back in his chair. I don't think it's realistic to separate the two completely, he says. We're all part of the same society. Alyssa responds immediately. But do you think that sometimes the audience just wants entertainment without politics? The question hangs in the air. Chris exhales softly. The audience is quiet now. I think audiences want authenticity, he says. and authenticity sometimes includes discussing real-world issues. The tone remains respectful, but the discussion has circled the same theme several times now. A slight pause follows. The moderator glances at the clock, subtly aware of time. Live television keeps moving. Chris shifts in his seat, glancing toward the side of the stage briefly, as if checking something off camera. A producer steps just out of frame, not visible to the audience, but the movement is noticeable on the monitors. The moderator tries to wrap the segment smoothly. We have to take a quick break soon, but before we do, Alyssa begins one last follow-up. Just to close this part of the discussion, Chris raises his hand slightly, not interrupting aggressively, but signaling he wants to respond before the break. Yes, he says, voice calm but firm. I think I've said what I can on this topic. The room quiets. There's a brief silence, the kind that feels longer live than it does on screen. The moderator nods, attempting to transition. We appreciate your perspective. Chris offers a polite smile. Thank you for having me. The audience claps again, though the energy is more measured now. Then, as the panel prepares to move to the next segment, Chris looks toward the moderator and says something quietly off mic. The microphones don't pick up the words, but his expression suggests he's clarifying something with production. The moderator responds briefly, nodding. The audience doesn't know what's happening behind the scenes, but there's a slight shift in timing. A pause that feels just a little longer than planned. Chris adjusts his chair, glances once more toward the side stage area, and places his hands on the table. The conversation on screen continues for a moment, but his attention seems slightly divided. The hosts begin introducing the next topic, trying to move forward naturally. The audience claps to signal the transition. And as the cameras widen to include all panel members, the atmosphere feels steady again. But something subtle has changed in Chris's posture and focus, setting the stage for what will unfold in the next part of the show. The next topic begins to roll out smoothly, with one of the hosts shifting into a lighter discussion to reset the tone. The audience responds with applause, and the studio energy lifts slightly. It feels like the show is moving back into comfortable territory. Chris listens as another host asks him about fan interactions and how he handles criticism online. He nods thoughtfully, responding in a calm voice. I try not to engage in arguments on social media. It's easy for things to escalate quickly. The audience laughs lightly when he mentions reading comments, but deciding not to reply. The moderator smiles and says, "That's probably wise." For a moment, it seems like everything is balanced again. Then Alyssa leans forward once more, carefully revisiting the earlier discussion. Chris, just one more point on this topic before we move forward. Do you think public figures have a responsibility to help lower the temperature in political conversations? Chris listens, hands resting on the table. The room quiets slightly, sensing the seriousness returning. I think everyone has a responsibility to be respectful, he replies. That applies to public figures and everyone else. The audience gives scattered applause. Alyssa nods. And do you feel like your statements help do that? Chris pauses. I hope so. There's no tension in his voice, but there's a noticeable seriousness now. The moderator steps in gently. We appreciate that perspective. It's important for audiences to hear thoughtful responses. Chris gives a polite nod, but something subtle shifts again. He glances toward the side of the stage, where production staff are standing behind the camera line. A producer signals quietly. The moderator continues, transitioning to a planned question about his upcoming press appearances. Chris answers briefly, but his responses are shorter now, more contained. Another host asks about balancing media scrutiny with privacy. Chris answers carefully, explaining that public life comes with attention, but personal boundaries are important. The audience responds positively. Applause fills the room at the end of his statement. Then the moderator turns to Alyssa, inviting any final thoughts on the earlier discussion. Alyssa looks at Chris, maintaining a respectful tone. I appreciate you engaging with these questions. I know they're not always easy. Chris responds with a small smile. I respect the conversation. The atmosphere is calm, but there's a sense the exchange isn't fully resolved. The moderator begins to wrap up the segment officially. We want to thank Chris Evans for joining us today. Applause rises. The camera widens slightly. Chris stands slightly in response to the applause, a standard gesture. But instead of fully settling back for the next segment, he leans toward the moderator. He speaks quietly off mic again. The audience can't hear, but his expression is focused. The moderator nods in response. There's a brief pause in the flow of the program. Not dramatic, just a beat longer than usual. The hosts begin transitioning to commercial break cues. Chris turns toward the audience and waves politely. The applause continues. But instead of remaining seated as the next segment introduction begins, Chris stands fully. The moderator looks up, surprised but composed. He offers a polite thank you to the panel. The exchange is brief. Professional. Not heated. Then he steps slightly away from the table. The audience murmurs, not loudly but noticeably. The moderator continues speaking, trying to keep the broadcast moving. The camera shifts back to her and the remaining hosts, who exchange quick glances but maintain composure. Chris moves toward the side of the stage with a producer walking beside him. The audience watches closely, unsure if this is part of the planned schedule or an early departure. The moderator smoothly says, "We'll continue after the break." Applause fills the studio again, though some audience members are whispering. Chris exits the visible stage area calmly. No raised voices. No visible confrontation. Just a clear, quiet departure before the segment fully concludes. The camera cuts to the hosts, who resume conversation professionally, acknowledging that sometimes live television runs differently than planned. One host comments lightly, "Well, that was an interesting discussion." The others nod. The audience responds with mixed reactions, some applause, some chatter. And as the show heads into break, it's clear that something unusual just happened. Not explosive, not chaotic, but unexpected enough that viewers at home are left wondering what led to that moment and whether it was planned, spontaneous, or simply the result of a conversation that reached its limit. The stage lights remain bright as production prepares for the next segment, and the panel regroups, keeping the broadcast steady while the audience continues reacting to what they just witnessed. Back from break, the studio looks composed, but the energy has clearly shifted. The hosts are seated again, smiling for the camera, keeping the tone professional. There's no dramatic music, no exaggerated reaction. Just the steady rhythm of live television continuing. The moderator addresses the audience briefly. As you may have seen before the break, Chris needed to step away. We appreciate his time with us today. The audience claps politely. It's respectful, not chaotic. The panel moves forward with the next planned topic, but it's obvious the conversation from earlier is still on people's minds. Viewers in the studio are whispering. Some are replaying the moment on their phones. Behind the scenes, production staff are quietly coordinating the remainder of the show. Nothing appears tense on camera, just the normal adjustments that happen during live broadcasts. After the episode airs, clips of the exchange begin circulating online. Short video segments show the back and forth between Chris and Alyssa, especially the moments where the discussion became more direct. Viewers start sharing their interpretations, some saying it was a strong, thoughtful debate, others suggesting the questioning felt too pointed. On social media, reactions vary widely. Some posts praise the conversation for addressing the role of public figures in politics. Others argue that the exchange highlights how quickly interviews can become uncomfortable when topics grow serious. Comment sections fill with debate. Fans of Chris emphasize that he remained calm and respectful throughout the discussion. Others say that public figures should expect tough questions on live television. Entertainment pages begin covering the moment, describing it as an unexpected exit. Headlines frame it in different ways, depending on perspective. But anyone who watched the full segment can see that the exchange was largely measured, not heated, a structured discussion that gradually intensified. After the show, production sources clarify that Chris's departure was not dramatic or abrupt in tone. Simply a decision to step away before additional segments, which can happen during live scheduling adjustments. There was no visible conflict backstage, and the transition appeared organized. In interviews following the broadcast, panel members emphasized that the goal of the discussion was respectful dialogue. Alyssa later reiterates that asking challenging questions is part of the format, and that conversations about influence and responsibility are important topics for public figures. Chris's team does not issue a statement about the segment itself, but he continues with scheduled appearances elsewhere, maintaining his usual professional commitments. Meanwhile, viewers continue debating the moment online, not as a scandal, but as a reminder of how live talk shows function. Real conversations, real disagreements, real-time constraints. When topics are meaningful, discussions can become intense without becoming hostile. Inside the studio world, moments like this aren't uncommon. Guests sometimes feel a segment has run its course. Hosts sometimes decide to pivot quickly. Producers work in the background to keep everything flowing smoothly. Live television is built on adaptability. The audience reaction, both in the studio and online, reflects that reality. Some people appreciate seeing genuine exchange without scripted answers. Others prefer lighter entertainment. That balance is always part of daytime talk formats. As the episode concludes, the hosts thank the viewers and encourage continued engagement. They remind everyone that discussion is part of the show's purpose, even when opinions differ. And as clips continue to circulate, viewers form their own conclusions about what happened, whether it was simply a natural endpoint to a focused debate or a moment where the conversation reached its limit in real time. Now we want to hear from you. Share their opinion in the comments and subscribe to the Star Talks for more real talk show stories.